We finally have a minute to talk about something other than GPUs, and that's going to be a case. This is the Lancool 215 by Lian Li. It is a budget-oriented $70 airflow case, and as anything else that claims airflow in its marketing, we're going to be running this through our exhaustive suite for thermals, acoustics, noise, normalized thermals, and everything else. We have a couple hundred lines of case data now, and a lot of that in the last year or so has been airflow focused. This, however, is one of the cheapest of the airflow-focused cases that we've looked at anytime recently, and that's what makes it interesting. Before that, this video is brought to you by EK and the EK AIO series. We recently reviewed the EK AIO DRGB 360 as one of the top performers in our CPU cooler charts, advantaged from its fan performance and high-quality pump internals that we found during our teardown. If you're looking for a high-performance RGB CPU cooler with longer steady-state times, check out the EK AIO 360 and 240 at the links in the description below. So we first saw this case in secret back in March when we visited Taiwan and did a couple of factory tours, and understandably, since that time, the production of this case was delayed for reasons that surely nobody is aware of. But it's here now, and the release date currently is scheduled for October 12th. We'll see if Lian Li can stick to that. They've been moving their release dates a lot this year. If you're wondering, by the way, the 011 Mini is a case that we've got coming in. That's supposed to be arriving in November for purchase. So anyway, this case is pretty bare bones. It does have some addressable RGB LEDs, and it's got 3 stock fans. 2 of them are 200 millimeters. There is a caveat with these, which is that they're obstructed in the back, so not really 200 millimeters. The fans are, but the actual access to air going into the case is not fully 200 mil. But we're going to talk about that in the thermal section. Nearby competitors are plenty. There's the Cooler Master TD500 that we reviewed recently, performed pretty well in our testing. Be Quiet's 500DX is considerably more expensive, closer to the $100 mark, but is a very competitive airflow case if you can stretch the budget. And then there's also, closer to this one, the P400A in the $80 to $90 range when it's actually in stock, which appears to be pretty rare these days, although it has been out for a little while and it has been one of the most popular airflow cases. As sort of a joke, originally when Lian Li showed us this case, it was referring to it as a P400 or an H500 killer at the time. And the H500 series, plenty as they are, does include some kind of cheap ones, like the Cooler Master H500 blank, as we call it. And that was a $100 case originally, but also 200 millimeter focus for the front. And whenever you're buying 200 mil fans, a lot of the time you're buying partly for looks, because you're not really planning to take these out for the most part and swap them for something else. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. The fans are a lot of the look of these types of cases, and there's nowhere else you can put them. You're not going to be able to relocate them. So this is part looks, but a lot thermals. Externally, things are pretty obvious, so there are a bunch of holes punched in the back of the case. Lian Li has been working on improving its thermals in every aspect of the cases lately, especially after our Lancool 2 original review. They seriously improved things with the mesh and were pretty in touch with us as they were working on those improvements, as they were sort of ramping their design iterations. This front panel is not the ultra-fine mesh in the same sense that we would talk about with the Cooler Master NR600, but it is fairly fine, and there's no dust filter behind it, which for airflow is a positive, because you don't want multiple layers of mesh, because you're going to end up with holes aligned with steel or whatever the mesh material might be made out of, and then you just end up with no airflow. So a positive for airflow, but keep in mind dust management may be a consideration. That said, with these lower static pressure 200 millimeter fans, if you have other stuff in the room that's pulling air, this might not be competing with it. So that is a potential upside of the fans. In terms of assembly quality, the front panel is actually pretty difficult to remove on this case. There are some clips on the inside that you can push and try to force through, but it's really on there. And when we were speaking with Lian Li, it sounds like this is going to change. So there are plans to get this fixed for the... I'm not exaggerating this. Jesus. There are plans to get this resolved for retail, but obviously we can't review a product we don't have. So the way it works right now is what you just saw. Not the worst in the world. We didn't have to Dremel the clips off like we did on our Noctis 450 years ago, but this is definitely the NZXT just yank hard approach to removing a front panel. The upside is that at least they haven't tethered the panel to the case with cables, but that's not really impressive these days. All right, let's get to the build notes and the thermals and noise analysis by Patrick, then we'll talk conclusions. The front panel will rarely need to be removed at all, since the 200mm fans for intake can't be moved to any other location in the case. And it's unlikely that anyone would want to buy a Lancool 215 and then get rid of the 200mm fans that define it, just like the H500 from Cooler Master. These fans indirectly limit the radiator compatibility of the case as well. Radiators should be used with relatively high static pressure fans that correctly match their size. 200mm radiators are rare, and even the ones that do exist wouldn't fit in this case. And by the way, don't use these fans to cool a 120mm or 140mm wide radiator. Lian Li's product page shows another option, a 360mm radiator sandwiched between the two 200mm fans and three 120mm fans in a push-pull configuration. But the 200mm fans are redundant and add nothing but noise in this arrangement. Keep in mind the hub size alone, you're losing a ton of surface area on the radiator, so we don't recommend this. Nor do we recommend the tubes up radiator orientation that they used in that picture, but that's another story. That leaves the top of the case, which has space for two 140mm fans side by side or two 120mm fans, for a max of 280mm radiators supported. The rear exhaust slot only supports 120mm fans due to the narrow footprint of the case, but the rear fan can be adjusted up or down by 3 centimeters. The top of the case is 6 centimeters above the top edge of the motherboard, which is the effective limit for combined radiator and fan thickness. Lian Li's spec sheet claims a conservative 55mm here. 120mm wide radiators potentially have a little more wiggle room since they can be offset away from the board, resolving potential clearance issues with certain configurations. In Lian Li's advertising images, they also depicted a vertical GPU mount. There's no vertical mount included in the case, but like Phanteks, Lian Li is selling it as an add-on kit that replaces the horizontal mounts. We're not especially fond of vertically mounting air-cooled GPUs, but we found this style of add-on mounting to be about as effective as possible since it keeps the GPU cooler intakes away from the side panel. And our recent tests with the 3080 Fe and 2080 Ti Strix vertically mounted in the P400A confirm that. We'd recommend against using shroud top fans with a vertically mounted air-cooled GPU, the way that they are in this picture, since they have limited access to cool air and will do very little to help or be effective. And in some designs, it'll just see the hot exhaust pushed right back into the GPU cooler anyway. We'll cover the efficacy of the intake fans in the thermal section later on, but the size of the fans is purely decorative. They may be 200mm in diameter, but they're mounted on the front of a chassis that was built for 120mm and 140mm fans. So easily a third of each fan surface is blocked by steel. They still work just fine, but make no mistake, the reason these are 200mm fans rather than 140mm, like the ones the Lancool 2 Mesh uses, is purely aesthetic, not functional, while 140mm fans would maintain better pressure. In contrast, the rear of the case is unusually well ventilated, with holes punched from the top edge of the case right down to the surface of the power supply shroud. Hopefully, this will allow a direct front-to-back airflow pattern without hot air pooling around the CPU cooler. But again, we'll test that in the thermal section. Other than the LED and reset buttons, there's an illuminated power button, 2 USB 3 ports, and a combined mic and headphone jack. It's absolutely minimal on the I/O front, but this is a budget case. Moving on to the panels. The two side panels share the same attachment method, with 2 captive thumb screws at the back and 2 stamped out steel lugs at the front that slide into the chassis. It's a simple system and it works well. The steel side panel is reinforced with thick rolled over edges, and the glass side panel is bordered with a foam strip on the top edge to cushion it and a steel strip at the bottom edge to protect it from chipping. There are only 2 minor problems we can see here. Users should avoid bowing out the steel side panel since it only attaches to the case at the front and rear edges, and the glass panel has no handle at all. We'd like to see a handle on the rear edge, like the one on the steel panel. That'd make it a bit easier to pull out. The screws on the 200mm fans were not particularly tight in this case, but the relatively fragile corners on the fans had almost buckled in the case when we received it. This seems more a fault of the fan design than whoever assembled the case. The fans still work normally, but users should be extra careful when removing or replacing them, and don't over-tighten it. Lian Li told us that the fan hub stickers on the final production cases will be smaller, but this is the only design change to the fans, and the fans mechanically in our review are the same as the retail versions. The hard drive bay is interesting as the next point, and near the limit of the least possible material used for its construction. It can still hold two 3.5-inch drives, as is standard for mid-towers these days, but it's just a single bay that slots into the bottom of the case. One drive can be mounted inside, and one more on top. Installing drives requires screws, of course, so there's no fancy toolless sleds here, but slotting the bay itself into place underneath the shroud is toolless, which is a good thing since the full-length bottom filter prevents easy access to the bottom of the case. The bay can be mounted in two positions, forwards or backwards, to give more room to either the power supply or the front fans. As for the bottom of the case, the bottom filter is unusually large for a case that has a power supply shroud. It covers the entire floor of the case at approximately 40 by 16 centimeters. For the most part, that's a positive, but there are two problems with it that other cases have already solved. First, it's a rear eject filter, so taking it out for cleaning will require pulling the case out at least 40 centimeters away from whatever's behind it, probably a wall. Secondly, the rails for the filter are bulky and extend the full length of the case. They work well for their intended purpose, but they also form a skirt around the edge of the case that restricts airflow. The case legs are already stumpy at just under 2 centimeters, and the plastic rails cut that space in half, so there's less than a 1 centimeter gap for air at the bottom edges of the case. There's a reason this matters too. The power supply shroud is fully ventilated and has two 120mm fans on top, one of which is unusable because of the power supply, but still. The case floor is fully ventilated as well, and even the hard drive bay has perforations in its surface. The intent here was clearly to allow bottom intake, but the execution leaves a lot to be desired. For any users who want to try installing fans on the surface of the power supply shroud, we'd recommend finding a way to boost the case legs. Lian Li's own Lancool 2 mesh takes a similar approach with fan mounts on top of the shroud, but it has both more room for airflow underneath the case and plenty of ventilation along the one side of the shroud. Clearance underneath the power supply shroud is inadequate. We use a run-of-the-mill 8.5 centimeter tall ATX power supply for case reviews, and in this case, the surface of the power supply was nearly flush with the shroud. That's not automatically a problem, but the case is narrow enough that there are cable cutouts which overlap with the power supply, and they're almost completely unusable. Fitting a fan cable through, for example, would require pulling the connector through before the power supply is installed. The clearance is that tight. The Lancool 215 does have the advantage over the P400A in that it can fit larger power supplies if needed, like even the 22 centimeter long EVGA 1600 T2s that we use for overclocking. But the longer the power supply, the fewer cable cutouts will be available. On the subject of fitting large components, the 215 can technically fit up to SSI EEB motherboards by virtue of having a flat motherboard tray and stock intake fans that are installed on the outside of the chassis rather than the inside. We wouldn't recommend installing any board larger than SSI CEB, that's 12 inches by 10.5, since boards wider than 10.5 inches will cover the cable cutouts at the front of the case, and there are few other options for routing cables at all. Lian Li helpfully lists support for eATX boards, quote, with a maximum width of 280 millimeters, which is exactly the right width to cover up all the cable cutouts without corresponding to any actual form factor. With a normal ATX board installed, we found the cutouts on both the front and top edges of the board to be generously sized. Cable management room behind the motherboard tray tops out at about 2.4 centimeters, but Lian Li has done a good job of ensuring that cables from the front I/O line up with the included Velcro straps. They aren't bolted into the case, but there are side-by-side loops for the straps built into the case along the front and top edges that make tying down cables very easy. Given the limited space behind the motherboard tray, there'll inevitably be some clutter underneath the power supply shroud. But the compact design of the hard drive bay means that it doesn't need to be completely removed to make room for cables. Given that Lian Li is working with another company to manufacture this case, an interesting point is that they've still made an effort to make this case fit with the rest of the Lancool line, rather than buying a generic ready-made case off the shelf. They started there, but they've modified it. The shape of the front panel, the shroud, top, fan mounts, and the lighting in the front panel all seem likely to be elements that Lian Li has had design input on for this case to be part of the Lancool family. The fan and LED arrangement is basic, and therefore mostly not annoying. The front RGB fans have separate headers for LED and fan control, a positive change that Lian Li has made in its more recent cases. The built-in fan hub has 6 3-pin fan headers, all of the stock fans are 3-pin, and no speed control, but since the fans can be connected directly to the motherboard, that's fine. The stock 200mm fans in the front are fairly quiet, so running them at 100% at all times via the fan hub is not out of the question either. There are also 4 ARGB headers on the hub. 3 of which are populated out of the box, which can be cycled through a selection of built-in lighting profiles or controlled via a motherboard header. The front I/O has a separate LED control button rather than just repurposing the reset button, and that's a nice touch for such an inexpensive case. The 2 front fans and the Lian Li logo at the bottom front all contain LEDs. The logo is illuminated from a strip of 3 LEDs housed in the chassis, which is a clever way of getting lighting into the front panel cheaply and without tethering it to the chassis with wires, and it works well overall. If there's a weak point in the system, it's the molded plastic duct between the LEDs and the logo. It's slightly misshapen on our sample, and a small piece has chipped off. As we've already mentioned, it's impossible to rearrange the 200mm fans within the case, and it's hard to imagine a scenario where replacing them makes sense. Therefore, we mostly limited ourselves to our standard set of tests for thermals and noise, and 2 additional tests with a 120mm ID cooling fan turned down to approximately 1200 RPM. For the first, we removed the top filter and positioned the fan as top exhaust in the rearmost slot. For the second, we positioned it as intake on top of the power supply shroud in the frontmost slot. The shroud top mount further towards the rear of the case is better positioned to directly cool the GPU die, but this mount is practically flush with the surface of the power supply, making it useless. In the torture test, starting with just some Lian Li cases, CPU temperature averaged 45 degrees Celsius over ambient with the stock fan arrangement. This fell only slightly down to 44 degrees with the front panel removed entirely, indicating that Lian Li has done a good job of pairing the large intake fans with a front panel that doesn't restrict them, although the backing of the chassis does to some extent. The extra top exhaust fan didn't drop the CPU delta significantly below the baseline temperature delta of 45 degrees, while adding an intake fan to the top of the power supply shroud warmed it up slightly to 47 degrees because hot GPU exhaust was encouraged to move upwards in the case towards the tower cooler. The Lancool 2 mesh is tied with the 215 in this test at 45 degrees above ambient, while the original Lancool 2, of course, is much warmer at 56 degrees. Comparatively, 45 degrees above ambient for the average CPU temperature positions this case well. It's a few degrees below the P400A Digital's average of 48 degrees. The Lancool 215 and the Lancool 2 benefit from having a CPU exhaust fan as well. The P400A gets along just fine without it, but there's no denying that an exhaust fan behind a tower cooler helps in most configurations. P400A Killer as a name for the Lancool 215 might be overly ambitious, but so far the Lancool 215 is a high-performance alternative, and it does cost less than most of these cases that it shares space with on this end of the chart. For example, the Cooler Master H500 mesh and the Be Quiet 500DX are both nearby and both more expensive. In the same test, the GPU averaged 52 degrees Celsius above ambient. As with CPU temperatures, removing the front panel offered an improvement down to 49 degrees average, but still a small enough difference to indicate good front panel design. An additional top exhaust fan did help slightly as well, reducing the average to 50 degrees, while the shroud top fan had no significant effect. We're still interested in the idea of shroud top fans, as we have been with all of the Lancool cases thus far, but this isn't an effective implementation. Users might be able to get some use out of the mounting points for attaching other things than fans, but there just isn't enough access to air to make them useful as intake slots. The Lancool 2 mesh demonstrates its value here with an average of 49 degrees Celsius above ambient, while the original Lancool 2 non-mesh is again much warmer at 55 degrees. It's fortunate for Lian Li that the more expensive Lancool 2 mesh performs better, as they're dangerously close to competing with themselves as well as Phanteks. There are some other quality of life advantages to the Lancool 2 mesh as well, but those are covered in our full review of that case. Compared to the rest of the stack, 52 degrees above ambient for an average GPU temperature is fine, but not nearly as impressive as the CPU temperatures were. It's tied with the Cooler Master H500P mesh and the Be Quiet 500DX, but it's beaten by the P400A's 49 degree average and the TD500 mesh's 50 degree average. Part of the 215's disadvantage next to something like the Lancool 2 mesh may be the case's relative narrowness. The cooler on the GPU that we use for testing is both extremely wide and it is exhausting air out of the side. So that extra centimeter of clearance in the Lancool 2 mesh between the glass and the GPU cooler offers a real advantage. The 3D Mark stress test is a way of confirming the GPU torture results as well as seeing whether GPU temperatures are improved without any interference from CPU exhaust. The average GPU temperature here rounds to 51 degrees Celsius above ambient, but it's within 1 degree of the baseline average. The Lancool 2 mesh widened the gap in this test with an average of 47 degrees above ambient. The 215 has proven to be a strong case overall, so these GPU temperatures only appear unimpressive when compared to the previous CPU temperatures. For a $70 case though, this is still good. For Blender testing, we run the same render twice, once exclusively on the CPU and once on the GPU. For the first test, the CPU averaged 38 degrees Celsius over ambient, surprisingly much more towards the middle of the chart than the torture results, although competition is much tighter here and a difference of a fraction of a degree can create a deceptively large gap on this chart. It's tied with the stock NR600 and a few degrees warmer than the Lancool 2 mesh's average of 35.3 degrees. With the GPU render, average GPU temperature was 23.4 degrees Celsius above ambient, a slightly more favorable average compared to the rest of the chart than was seen in the torture and firestrike tests. The P400A was within error and tied at 23.2 degrees, while the Lancool 2 mesh retained champion status at an impressive 20.8 degrees average. Beyond its usual purpose, here the standardized fan testing gives us a chance to see what case thermals are like with normal-sized 140mm intake fans, so we can see whether Lian Li's decision to use 200mm fans on a standard mid-tower helped or hindered them. Average CPU temperature was 43 degrees Celsius above ambient in this test, better than the 45 baseline and even the 44 degrees Celsius average with the front panel removed. The smaller fans perform better here, but these are 1400 to 1500 RPM Noctua fans, and they only improved the CPU temperature by a couple degrees. We consider that a good mark for Lian Li's stock fans. As for the rest of the cases tested with standardized fans, the 215 is tied here with the Lancool 2 mesh, which makes sense. The front panel mesh densities of the 215 and the Lancool 2 mesh are similar, if not identical. That makes the 215 1 degree cooler than the P400A and P500A digitals here, which is basically error at this point. They're the same functionally. It's right at the top of the chart for CPU temperatures once again. This is a favorable case design for CPU tower coolers and air coolers with plenty of ventilation at the top and rear faces of the case. Average GPU temperature in this test was 54 degrees Celsius, warmer than baseline average of 52. Even though the 215 isn't chart topping, for at least GPU cooling as a category, it's evidently not the fault of just the stock fans alone. Stock noise levels with all case fans at 100% was 38.8 dBA, looking at noise alone versus everything else, and that's barely an audible increase over the 36 dBA threshold that we use for noise normalized testing. Reducing noise to that threshold required reducing the case fans alone to 75% speed in BIOS. But in reality, that translated to a reduction of only about 100 RPM for the big 200mm fans, down from 700 to 600. One major advantage of extra large fans is their overall silence. So this is a strong category for the 215. It might be stronger still if it weren't for a bunch of steel behind the intake fans interfering with them. And by the way, you want to avoid reducing the speed of these larger fans as much as possible because the pressure loss is disproportionately high when compared to smaller fans that are more targeted. The increase in average temperature was overall small. The CPU delta was up from 45 degrees Celsius to 47 over ambient. Compared to other noise normalized results, the 215 is extremely strong on CPU temperatures, besting the previous coolest average of 50 degrees scored by the Lancool 2 mesh. This is still a relatively new test, so we don't have cases as old as the Cooler Master H500 mesh included on this chart. We'd expect it to do similar here and also well. In terms of silent CPU air cooling, the 215 is hands down the best case on this chart so far, beating the digital variants of the P400A and P500A. The increase in GPU delta was even smaller, up from 52 to 53 degrees. That's not much warmer than the P400A's 52 degrees Celsius average, but the Lancool 2 mesh pulls ahead a little further at 51. Again, air-cooled CPU temperatures in the 215 are exceptional, while GPU temperatures are on the good side of average. Overall, the Lancool 215 is a pretty competitive case. At its $70 price point, if it cost any more, it'd be difficult to justify. You start getting into territory where you're basically recommending it, if it's say $90 instead, basically recommending it only because you like the look of it, and that'd be mostly about it. But at $70, this is competitive. It's sort of in somewhat competition with the old RL06, which is no longer available, but was a phenomenal case at the price when you could get it for the $70, $80 range. It's not too distant from the P400A, which is advantaged in a few tests here. And it's also somewhat nearby the Silverstone Fara R1, although that didn't perform particularly well in our test. So that makes the 215 one of the better thermal performers at its price. And it's worth considering, but there are some downsides you also need to think about. One of them, this isn't something you should really be combining with much of any kind of water cooling, not just open loop, but closed loop also. It's fairly limiting there. For the front panel, you should not be putting a radiator behind static pressure challenged 200 millimeter fans. They're going to suffer a lot for it. You're going to end up with blockages where they don't make sense. There's already blockages from the chassis behind the fans. So just Lian Li has that in their marketing images. We would encourage you not to do that. It's just, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So don't really want to put a radiator in the front is what we're saying there, unless you replace the fans, and at that point, why are you buying this case? So you should leave these alone for the most part. The top, you could put a radiator in. You're mostly limited to 280 mil and maybe 240 if you want to leave some space for the motherboard and VRM clearance, heatsink clearance rather, if that's a concern with whatever board you choose. Other downsides, ease of installation is not too bad. It's fairly standard. A couple of small hiccups like we discussed earlier, but routing things like fan cables before installing your power supply is something to keep in mind. It's mostly a minor annoyance and obviously is easily worked around by just installing things in the order that's correct for this case. But it does show that there are clearly limitations for the ultra budget approach. And why it's ultra budget? Well, Lian Li is not manufacturing this one itself. We've been to its factories. It is not being made in those. This is being made by a supplier, and Lian Li has worked with the supplier to modify it, customize it, and ultimately, though, they're sort of taking an existing tooling for the chassis interior. They're modifying other parts of the case. It keeps the cost down. There's really nothing wrong with that. It's pretty standard in the industry, but that is why it's cheap. And what that means is that it's not completely impossible that more of this type of case could feasibly pop up in the market at some point, assuming there's not some sort of exclusivity agreement between them. Other cases that we would recommend checking out. So to give you a quick list, these are not directly competitive with this case in price, but they're similar in what they're trying to do, and most of them are in the, say, probably $15 to $30 range, more expensive. So if you're willing to spend a little bit more money, it is worth looking into our reviews of the Lian Li Lancool 2 Mesh. It's worth looking at the review of the Be Quiet 500DX, the pure base, and also the P400A digital. Again, the Cooler Master TD500A is worth looking at, but P400A is probably the one that we'd point you towards the most between that list of cases. But this is not a bad case. It does fine overall for its price point. It is roughly competitive. The ease of installation, quality of life features are the most lacking, but thermals are fine, especially considering the blockages behind the fans. So Lian Li did well to maximize what they had here. And if you are looking at an alternative, we'd say it's either 215 or P400A for the most part. So check those out. Overall, though, this seems fine. So that's high praise from us. Thanks for watching. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, and you can subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.